What is going on, everybody? Welcome to episode 3 of the Double Feature podcast. We've had so much fun these first 2 episodes with some really interesting movie pairings. Today, I'm joined by Mr. Jacob Blunden. How are you?
Hi. Hello. I'm good. Yes, you've had two extremely talented, very good guests with some very interesting and unique movies, and now you're stuck with me.
I don't know if I would say I'm stuck with you. I'm very, very interested to get into the double feature you chose, actually. But before we do that, do you want to kind of introduce yourself to everyone? Let the people know how you got into movies, like what brought you to this point. Give them a little insight.
Well, I am a 30-year-old film critic. That hurts to say. Well, maybe not a film critic. I am a 30-year-old film fan who watches a lot of movies. Let's just say that. And I've been in love with film for pretty much as long as I can remember. Um, we've never really understood why film, especially given my parents aren't big film nuts and don't really love film that much. They're more my dad's a big sports nut. And my mom enjoys film. She likes film a bit, but she's definitely not neither of them are anywhere near as fanatic as I am. And I guess a lot of it came from when I was young and there was a Blockbuster like 5 minutes down the road, and I would ride my bike on there every weekend and and I had a 10 for $10 deal, and that's what I would do every single weekend. I'd go down, I'd rent ten movies for $10 and, would watch all of them, and that's kind of really where it all came from. I started falling in love with movies there and really started to develop my palette and just kind of came from that. Like I kind of grew up watching movies. I've always loved going to the cinema. Like the cinema is kind of my second home, and I feel safe at a cinema. I've never really I love the experience of sitting in a movie theater and watching a movie. There's nothing that can replicate it, and it's kind of why I struggle a lot with watching movies at home compared to in a theater. Like now, if I miss a movie in theaters, I generally won't watch it. It'll generally take me a while to actually get to it. I'm not some, and same with the Netflix movies, and same with streaming films. Is if it's playing at a theater and it's like, okay, you have to be there at this time on this date, I'm a lot better with scheduling myself around that than I am with, oh, hey, it's just available online for whenever you're free. And I generally will not find, like, I'll generally not be able to find time, even though I have the time to do it. I just generally won't because I'm always just, I think the cinema and I think the theater going experience is part of movie watching. I think it's a massive part of movie watching, and I think while a lot of obviously movies transcend watching them in a theater, I think being able to see these movies on the biggest screen possible with the best sound possible is an important aspect of movie watching, and I think that there is a romanticism with seeing movies in a theater that is very important, and that's kind of where I'm at with cinema.
On that note, what's the last double feature you actually did at a movie theater? Like, what's the last one you can remember?
Um, well, the last it was only a couple of weeks ago, which was Pinocchio and Strange World, which was a very weird double feature that I did. Because I needed to see both of those movies, and and so I did the double feature because they were both playing at the same back to back, and it was just easiest to do that. Very weird double feature. Very on the one hand, this incredibly engaging and beautiful animated film by Guillermo del Toro, and the other one a very average Disney movie in Strange World. So they didn't really pair very well, but I have a feeling they're going to be compared to each other come Oscar season. So we'll see what happens there.
Fair enough. Do you do double features at movie theaters very often, or is that more something you tend to do at home?
Um, I tend to do I tend to do double features at home a lot. When I first graduated high school, there's a 4-year stretch when from 2011 to the end of 2013, no, sorry, 2010 to the end of 2013, a little bit into 2014, where every single Thursday, without fail, I would go and see every movie that opened. So it wouldn't just be double features; it would be triple features. It would be 4 days. The most I ever did was 6. I did 6 movies in one day. That nearly killed me, and I did that when I didn't have a driver's license, so that was even stupider. And I had to somehow get home that night, but I really loved it, and it's something I miss. You know, not being a uni student and having no free time to be able to do. Like I miss having that one day a week, and it being a Thursday, and it being $7.50 for a movie to be able to just go. All right, I've got this day where I can just start at 10 a.m. and go through and watch all of these movies, and I don't have anything to worry about. I don't have a care in the world. And I would do it every single week without fail. I would go and see everything that I possibly can. It's a lot harder for me to do now because a lot of the time I see the movies early. A lot of the times I'm working on Thursdays and I'm not able to go on the actual day. So I'll generally either go at the night or I'll wait for the weekend or whenever, or I've seen the movies already. And so it's a lot harder for me to do double features in an actual theater now. Um, Generally, I'll try and do them when I really like when theaters do the, "Hey, see the old one before the new one," and I'll generally try and always go to that. So when they're playing, um, the last one we did was, I think, Avengers, because they didn't do them for a while, but when Endgame came out, they'd play Infinity War beforehand. So you'd just roll straight in, and I really enjoyed being able to do those. Um the same with one that I really vividly remember was the final Harry Potter film. Watching part one and then just going straight into part two, which was really really great as a first time experience watching the part two. So I try and do them. I try and do them in a theater whenever possible, but lately it's been a bit difficult.
Fair enough. You said the last double feature you saw in a theater didn't really pair well for you. What do you think makes a good double feature other than obviously being like a Harry Potter movie where it's part of a series? Like outside of that, what makes a good double feature to you?
I think something where the themes and the ideas of the film together pair really well. So something where both films together are telling kind of the same sort of same sort of story, and have either approach it from a different angle or they're approaching it from a different perspective, but the idea at the heart of it is the same idea, and I really like when double features have that. Plus, also both movies are good. I think that is very important to a double feature. I think if I'm going to sit there and watch both movies, both of them have to be enjoyable for me to consider it being a good double feature. So
I
I think
mean,
that is
you
important.
your standards might be a little high with that last one, but fair enough, I guess.
It it is a little tough, but when I'm me when it comes to a lot of film reviewing, but no, that's kind of a big standard for me. Is for a double feature to really work, for me to be like, that was awesome, and I'm glad we saw both of them together, is when both films have narrative beats or thematic beats or something where they both kind of gel together when you're like, okay, you're approaching X subject from this angle and that film's approaching it from this angle, but it's all kind of the same sort of thing you're about. Or, their themes are the same, or they're approaching a certain event from the same angle or something. Like a really good one that I did a long time ago was Dunkirk and The Darkest Hour. They're both, and The Darkest Hour. They're both approaching the storming of Dunkirk at the same time, but from two very different perspectives. And I really I enjoy those type of movies where it's like, okay, those two work and complement each other really well.
So, outside of the kind of elements you just mentioned, from more of a personal perspective, I guess, why did you choose, how did you get to the double feature that we're going to be talking about today?
Um, the biggest the biggest element for why I chose these ones is the existential crisis I'm currently going with because I just turned 30. So both of these movies deal with turning 30.
They do.
And
They
well,
really do.
with to an extent, they both deal with suddenly dealing with the fact that you are now an adult, and not just in terms of the you're an adult who should kind of have their life together, who should have an idea of where your life is going, and you kind of know, and you're kind of past the fuck up phase of life where, you know, oh, I fucked up, but I was in my 20s, so it doesn't really count. You're kind of past that phase of your life. You're now into the point where it's, hey, you kind of got to have an idea of what you want to do with your life. And I think both films approach that from a unique and different way. That I'm doing one from a more and two from two also very different time periods as well.
Yeah.
From one in the 90s and dealing with it coming during the AIDS crisis, and during what was it like in the late 80s, early 90s, and then one dealing with it during COVID, and how does someone deal with turning 30 during COVID. And I think that that's two very different and unique perspectives, but also somehow also they hit the same beats as well, because it's a during a health crisis, and which is quite fascinating. And I think that they complement each other really well.
And they both have really catchy songs about turning
That
30.
too. Yes,
So,
that
you
too.
know,
They
that's a
both
real highlight.
yes, they both definitely have very catchy songs with dealing with turning 30.
Well, on that note, why don't you tell the good people what movies you've chosen and tell us if you think there's a specific order they should be watched in if you're going to do a double feature.
Okay, so the two films that I picked were Tick Tick Boom from 2021, and Inside from 2021. These are two films that deal with turning 30, that deal with the existential dread of not just turning 30, but believing you what are you doing with your life, and where are you in life, and really looking at what have you accomplished so far, comparing yourself to other people and what they have accomplished so far in their life at that point in their age. um and I think I think it's probably best to start with Inside, because Inside is the more experimental. It's the more, hey, this is the reason I would suggest starting with Inside, and it's how I normally would watch them, is because when you start with Inside, while it ends on a positive, it's not as positive as Tick Tick Boom ends. I think Tick Tick Boom definitely ends on more of a Tick Tick Boom ends on the sad ending because of what happens, but I think Tick Tick Boom ends on a more optimistic, you're going to be okay ending, whereas in Inside is a lot more of a, oh god, I'm in dread. I'm like, we're still stuck in this thing, and oh god, help us all. And I think that's why I think I would prefer to start with Inside, because I kind of want to be leaving without the dread of, oh god, help me.
I guess I could see that. I just think it's funny that when I think about the way that they both end, I think it gives us a lot of insight into you, which one you think is the more hopeful ending.
Yeah, I think I think again the the tragedy that is within Tick Tick Boom, there is the tragedy of it, and that comes with from the, that does kind of put like the stamp on, hey, yeah, he didn't have that much long after turning 30, and I get that perspective, but I also have the story was not written from that perspective. It was written from the perspective of trying of optimism and hope afterwards, and that's kind of how I try and try and view it.
All right.
So
Well, we'll save the optimism and hope for last then. Why don't we start with talking about Inside? What is it? Like we can get into depth into Inside, which I would like to do. But just to kind of start it off, what was it other than the existential dread? Like what was it about Inside that hit you so hard? Because you were very newly introduced to Bo Burnham at that point when we had watched Inside.
yeah, so we went through. I went through and I watched all four Bo Burnham specials probably within like 5 days of each other. I had seen Eighth Grade, and that was it. Um, I like Eighth Grade. Like I think Eighth Grade's a good movie. I'm not like I don't love Eighth Grade the way a lot of other people do. But again, I wasn't a teenage girl, so it doesn't speak to me the same way that I'm sure it speaks to a lot of other people. Um, First two Bo Burnham specials I thought were funny and entertaining. The third one hit me. His final song really hit me hard when he's talking about how I need to please you. My whole goal is to please you, and it's killing me doing this. Like I think when when it was starting to actually really dive into the he's opening up about how much doing comedy and how much talk and doing this type of comedy is actually really hurting him, and his desire and just absolute need to please people is both a blessing and a curse. Like I was really fascinated by that. And then when we watched Inside, we were going I think Inside is the quintessential uh, piece of art that is going to be covering COVID. I think when we look back on pieces of art that were made during COVID and during and about COVID, I think Inside is going to be the one that we can look to and say that is what it felt like. That is the most raw and impassioned and kind of perfect way that encapsulates all of the feelings that went within COVID of the hey, I get to chill at home and do nothing for 2 weeks when it first started, and we all had that feeling of oh, this is a little bit weird and fun. Oh, we can get through this, and then it just stayed. And I think Burnham really captures the length of COVID really well without ever making it feel boring. And and the kooky weirdness of it all, and the he manages to hit all of how most people were feeling during this time of just pure trepidation and dread and fear that we all felt. And I think that's why Inside hit me more than what I was expecting it to, and more than his other specials, because I thought it was the most raw and the most personal one out of all of them. I think this is the one where he is definitely the most open, and it's also the one where I felt the most that I could connect to him, and where I really went, no, I know how this feels. Um, a lot of his specials, again, like I didn't really grow up on Burnham. I didn't really follow him on YouTube. I didn't really know a lot about Burnham. So I think when going through and watching the show, his old specials, and he's kind of referencing stuff he did on YouTube and stuff he did when he was younger, it's like, okay, I like that doesn't connect with me. Whereas in this one, I feel like is very much referencing the fact that yeah, I was a YouTuber, but that means nothing now, and I'm also in desperate need of an audience. I am in desperate need of adulation and people, and yet I am now stuck inside by myself doing this godforsaken special with no crew, no one helping it, and I just think that there is something about it that has this personal nature to it and this sense of just exposing something about him that we've never seen before from any of his other specials.
So do you, because I remember we had talked about this in 2021 at the end of the year when we were making our lists.
Yeah.
Do you consider it more of a film than a special? Like, would you say it's more of like a documentary, or like how do you classify it in your mind?
I I think personally I think it's a film, but I think it's a film from a perspective of essentially a one man show. Um, and while it's not a traditional film, I think it's kind of very experimental in that way of. I'm not going to begrudge anyone who says this isn't a movie or a film or cinema or anything like that. I'm not going to begrudge you with that because it's not cinema in the traditional sense. And I understand that. And I'm not going to ever debate someone and fight someone over that. But
It's not a film in a traditional sense, but it's also not a comedy special in a traditional sense.
exactly. And that's kind of where I think it's this own unique beast that again, like it doesn't fit into any basket, which is why I think it is why I would just call it an experimental film. Because if anything, that's the basket it fits into the best. Because it doesn't fit into a documentary basket. Personally, I don't think, because I think it's a little too self-referential. To I think there isn't the distance for it to be a documentary. I think it's too much about the subject for it to be like the subject has too much control for us to consider it to be a documentary, given he is controlling every single aspect of what he's telling, and all of it could be fake, all of it could be real. We just don't know. Um, so I don't think it can be considered in the strictly documentary bucket. I don't think it can be strictly in the comedy special bucket, given the nature of it being a audienceless, heavily cut, like the way it's filmed over 18 months, like the way it's filmed. I don't think it can be considered a comedy special in the strictest sense. And then again, I don't think it can be considered a film because there's no like traditional film elements for it. So I think an experimental film is probably its best bucket, because what it's trying to do is very different to a lot of other aspects of quote unquote cinema.
I think that's probably one of the most interesting parts about it for me is that I don't know if I can personally think of anything I've ever seen quite like it in
Yeah.
terms of the way it was constructed, in terms of the actual content. Um, I think experimental is probably the perfect way to describe it. Do you I know that a lot of people probably look at this at Inside, and the first thing they think of is the music. Is that the first thing is that what stands out to you about it? Or is it the fact that it's kind of this experimental film? Is it more the kind of cut scenes? Like what is it that you really gravitate towards?
It's definitely the soundtrack. I think the soundtrack is definitely the strongest part of it, and I think that's the thing that I gravitate to towards the most, especially the third act soundtrack. I think the final 4 songs on the soundtrack the are really the thing that I gravitate towards the most, and where it really, like, gets hits you emotionally and hits you in the gut and says, "Hey, yeah, live with it." Like, there's a lot of aspects from the soundtrack that I think work better, but I also think that it simply being, "Oh, here's an album," wouldn't have worked. I think
Sure.
it is a it needs the cutscenes, it needs the construction of a film around it for it to have the payoff for these songs and these elements to have the payoff that they do at the end.
So, do you have a favorite, or is it those 4 songs that you referenced, or, like, what do you like, kinda lay it out for me.
Okay, so that funny feeling is my favorite out of all of them, just because I think that that song just basically perfectly surmises where we are as a society right now, and I think that one I think really hits me harder than really any of them out of all of them. I think that one is this when you really listen to the lyrics, it's kind of just like, oh hey, yeah, this is our generation. This is what we were left. This is what we're going to be dealing with for the next 30, 40 years. And you have it's that funny feeling like that just I so that song from the first time I heard it to now is still my favorite. All Eyes on Me, I think, is the most heartbreaking out of all of them. I think All Eyes on Me is painful in the most. It's painful in a heartbreaking way, and I think um, I actually really hate it when they cut the dialogue bit. So you can on if you go on like Apple Music or Spotify or whatever, there's two versions of it. There's the one that's All Eyes on Me, and then it went and halfway through the song he tells the story about how he was going to come back to comedy. There's a version of it where it cuts that, and I think you lose a lot when you cut that. I think that is such an important part of this because it's such an important part of his journey and an important part of essentially what COVID robbed of him, and what COVID robbed of a lot of people, and the creativity and the need, like the ability to be ready to come back out into the world, and then the world's shut down and said, no, you can't. And I think, and having this sudden weight of, I need to create, I need to be productive during this time when I just mentally and physically can't be. And I think that that's really important and a serious discussion that we like that I do think is something that resonates with me, especially because during COVID, when during the lockdowns, that was part of the discussion of, oh, make sure you're all hustling and make sure you're all like working and using this time. And it was like, yeah, but I'm just exhausted. Like everyone meant it was this it wasn't a 18-month vacation the way that it was presented to a lot of people and the way that it came across as given, you know, oh, well, you sat at home and got paid by the government for 18 months. No, a lot of people didn't. Most people didn't. They were stressing. They were filled with anxiety. They were questioning, where am I going to get my next paycheck from? Where am I going to work next? And like, I was lucky that we weren't, but at the same time, it still wasn't an easy 18 months. It was filled with a lot of dread. It was filled with a lot of uncertainty. It was filled with a lot of anxiety and fear. And I think that this special perfectly surmises that feeling in a 3-minute song. And I think that that's why that ending hits me so hard.
I think that was most interesting was that you and I had completely different perspectives watching this. Just from a, I did grow up following Bo Burnham
Mm,
and his specials, and every time he put out a new special, that was the first thing I did was sit down and watch it. And
mm,
I was really there through the progression of his entire career and watching him kind of learn who he was through comedy and get to present these, updated versions of who he wanted to present every time he put something out. And watching this, watching Inside was, it was such a different chapter than anything we had ever seen before. And like you talked about earlier, I think it's the most personal he's ever let himself be.
mm.
I think it's the least that he's ever tried to put up a front or put up a kind of character that is still partially him, but I
Yeah,
feel like this was the most real that we've ever seen him. And there were, elements of the kind of comedy that we've seen before, like, and there were self-referential things like Problematic, like the song
yeah,
Problematic is probably the most referential thing in terms of previous parts of his career. But
yeah,
then you did have songs like That Funny Feeling, or even All Eyes on Me, which All Eyes on Me feels like such a perfect continuation from the last song of his previous special that you were
yeah,
talking about.
yeah,
It feels like the perfect continuation of that, where you're getting that direct update on
y-
his where he's at mentally.
yeah,
Um and I do feel like you still get, the really clever, quick kind of humor in a lot of these songs, um, that those of us who followed him would be used to. But then there are other songs that just slow it down and are much more simplified and feel like it just feels like a new facet of him, which is really really interesting. I think it's easily the most impressive thing he's ever made. And
yeah,
I also think it's fascinating that it reached so many people that, you know, like you, for example, like there are plenty of people like you who hadn't followed his career, had maybe heard his name because he was basically the original YouTuber or at least
yeah,
one of the handful of them.
mm,
And I think it really just struck me that there were so many people who watched it and went, "Oh fuck." Like that's how that was me. Like that's exactly the visual and audio and sensory representation of what the pandemic was like for
yeah,
so many people. Like people were laughing and crying and getting so emotional and so overwhelmed watching it. And I just think that's such a unique community experience that I don't think I've ever quite seen outside of a movie theater. Like it was basically everyone getting to watch it and still have that big
mm,
communal experience.
yeah, yeah. Like, and that's something about it that I think works really well for it as it aged, and watching it via Twitter, like, which sounds silly, especially today now, but when it dropped, and we were all pretty much having that communal experience via Twitter because we were all still stuck at home, and it's just it's that like that strangeness about COVID, and I think the way this has, I think the way that this special really explains, not explain, that showcases how audience, society, and people were feeling during COVID, and is something that is why I think that it's such a really unique and different film, and it works really well for just where I am at in life right now.
Yeah. No, I can understand that, and I do think that it's probably the because I was very much in the headspace of I don't want to watch anything that has to do with the pandemic. I don't want to
Yeah.
watch movies about it. I don't want to watch things that reference it. Like we were still in the tail end of
Mm.
lockdowns. Like
Yeah.
we're still in it now, but we were still in like the deep end of it at that point, and I was not far enough removed from just feeling that kind of dread from being inside of it. I didn't want to watch anything that had to do with it. But
Mm.
inside was so real and so cathartically genuine, and you felt what he was going through. Like,
Mm.
even though they were songs that were written and there were takes that were done more than once, and like there were things about it that were premeditated, but they were written as he was going through it. They were
Yeah.
things that he was feeling and experiencing and trying to work through turning 30 while he was stuck, at home,
Yeah.
not able to kind of waltz into that next chapter of his life he was finally ready for to go back to comedy. And to
Yeah.
me, I'm not a comedian. I don't perform on stage, but to me, that was exactly where I had felt like I was at, where before the pandemic hit, I felt like I was in a place mentally and personally in my own life that I was ready to do whatever that next step was supposed to be. And then COVID hits and you feel like your whole life is on pause and you
Yeah.
just can't do anything about it. And mentally, that just wipes away any progress you thought you had made towards whatever that next chapter in your life was. And watching Bo go through that and talk about being like, "Oh, well, I guess I'm 30 now and still just stuck inside and I don't really know what the path forward is anymore. Like I don't know
Yeah.
what I'm doing." It was just it was the only time that I sat there and went, "I'm glad that I watched something that had to do with what we're all still stuck in right now."
Yeah. No, and that's exactly how I felt the first time I watched it. Like that was, you know, I watched like I think it hit me in a way that I don't think you were expecting when we
No,
first
I
watched it.
wasn't I was not ready for it to make you genuinely emotional.
Yeah, and it still does. Like I watch it now, and I watch this way too often. Like
You
I watch it
you
all the
listen
time.
to it in the car.
Yep.
You'll just put it on, like, on your
Yeah.
phone sometimes, like
Yeah. I this one, the Inside is definitely one of the more impactful pieces of art, and I think that's the best way of saying it. And I think that it doesn't really have a it doesn't really have a codification. It's a genuine piece of art, and I think it's a piece of art about COVID and about life during COVID, and that's what I think is its legacy and what we are going to experience going forward with it, and that's why I love it so much. It's the perfect encapsulation of how I felt and what I felt like I was going through during COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, moving on to a health crisis that neither of us really lived through or have any
Mm,
first-hand understanding of, Tick Tick Boom is has that connection of someone navigating through a time where there's so much uncertainty with a big health crisis,
mm,
and it doesn't quite approach it the same way, and it definitely goes about it in a way that I think serves the story while still showing you what it was like to live in that time,
mm.
because our protagonist isn't directly affected
Yeah,
by it,
yeah,
but the world around him is falling apart,
mm.
essentially. What is it about Tick Tick Boom that really got to you? Was it the same? Was it the music, or was it more of the story? Or
Yeah, so Tick Tick Boom, like I really love the music of Tick Tick Boom. I think the music is amazing, but this one was the performance from Andrew Garfield and the story. I think, and the story was that it's telling about a man who is terrified of turning 30, who's terrified about his legacy, who is comparing himself to where his peers or his idols were when they were his age. Like I that element of the film spoke to me way more than a lot of the music numbers, which again, the music enhances those themes and those elements, but I think just the story itself is what really pulled me towards this and why I think this movie is such a genuine piece of art and just a genuinely fantastic film.
so was it specifically Jonathan Larson's story that really kept you engaged? Or was it more of just the full, like everything that was happening?
So I went in not knowing much about Jonathan Larson. I'm not massive on Rent. I'm not real. Okay, I'm not a massive.
You're not really you're not a music person
I'm not
really, which is
really a theater
hilarious
geek
with
at all.
this episode.
I
Like
know,
this
yeah.
is really
I'm not a music person or a theater geek. Like I've never really grown up around Broadway. I've never really grown up with shows. Like I, you know, I was in a few shows as a kid. But like shows are expensive and we don't get them very often. Brisbane, Australia gets like one that stays here for 6 months and it's generally something giant. Like it's one of the big ones that everyone's heard of, or and it's about a decade after everything happens. Like, all right, put it into perspective. Hamilton comes to Brisbane for the first time ever for 2 months in like 4 months, and that's what 7 years removed. Wicked came here for the first time in the 2010s. Like there's I never grew up as a theater kid. I never really grew up being able to see Broadway or go to the shows or any of that because it was just we didn't get them. And the ones that I saw were school productions of the classics. So I was in a production of Singing in the Rain. I was in a production of My Fair Lady. Our school did a Les Mis at one point. I like there there were that was my connection to Broadway was the shows that our school did, and I watched some of those movies. Um, so going into Tick Tick Boom, not really knowing the Jonathan Larson story, I knew of Rent. I had never sat down and watched Rent from start to finish. I had never really listened to the music. I just knew of it. And that was mostly from a Team America parody. Like that was the Team America parody was how I knew of Rent. And so going in and watching this and I was just absolutely enthralled the entire time. Like the really it wouldn't maybe it wouldn't I wouldn't say it was Jonathan Larson's story per se because it was Jonathan Larson. I think it was more Jonathan Larson's story as someone who is going through a quarter life crisis because they're suddenly turning that because there's now a 3 in front of their number of their age and they're questioning what have they done in their life. And I think that him as an artist telling that story is what I connected to more than Jonathan Larson going through his life story.
Yeah. Yeah, sure. So I definitely think that there are a lot of strong elements to this movie as someone who's far more musically inclined. Like the music really stuck with me. and I think they did a really great job with translating it to the screen.
Mm.
I think I'm curious what you think. I personally think, as you kind of touched on, that the acting performances are probably the strongest part of this movie. Like
Mm.
Andrew Garfield, this is probably the role of a lifetime, in my opinion, for him. Like I think he's always fantastic. I think he's just generationally talented. But this role, I think, really required something from him and asked him to do something that we've never seen before. Not just because he had to sing, but I just think this kind of story was something we had never seen from him before. And I think that he was able to really bring a part of himself to it
Mm.
that shines through. And I think the movie is strong in a lot of aspects, but I think the performances are probably the best part of it.
Yeah. I don't disagree with you. I think Andrew Garfield is the reason this movie works from the emotional and why it hits me as hard as it does is because you believe it the entire time. You believe his story, you believe him through the entire thing. And I think that's why I'm so drawn to it the entire film, like, because yeah, I've loved Andrew Garfield for like for the last decade as an actor. I think pretty much everything he's in is he is fantastic in, um, and I think yeah, this is the role of a lifetime for him, and I think he was sensational in it. I think he is terrific in every single aspect of this movie, and I really just love love watching him go through essentially going through every single aspect of this film, and I think he is definitely the best part, and the perform everyone involved in this. I think the performances all around are fantastic and incredible, and just the way that a lot of it's in its subtlety as well, where I think Robin DeJesus is the way he is his story kind of plays in the background through the whole thing, and I love the way that that's handled.
Yeah, I think Robin De Jesus is I think the chemistry he has with Andrew Garfield is great. Like I
Mhm,
think you believe that they've known each other for years and years and years and that they mean a lot to each other on a very deep level.
mhm,
And I do think the way that Michael's story plays out is perfect in terms of what the movie's trying to accomplish. Like the story's not about him, but he's sprinkled in and peppered in almost as Jonathan's, I don't want to say conscience, but almost in that kind of sense where he pops in and is like, "Hey, did you do this?" or like, "You need to do this," or he's kind of almost trying to keep him on track a little bit with how
yeah,
hectic and how in his head Jonathan always is.
yeah,
And he's so concerned with feeling like he's running out of time to create his masterpiece, to write his musical. And Michael is kind of there to remind him there's a life outside of that that's happening around him. And I
mm.
think that's a really great way for the movie to do that.
Yeah, no, I don't disagree with you, and I think that that's where this film to me, that's where this film really shines, is the relationships and the connections that all these characters have with each other, and I think really the heart and soul of this is the love, I guess that the all the characters have for each other, and how I just think that the story is its strongest point, and that's why I love this movie.
What did you think of it as a directorial debut from Lin
I
Manuel?
So I think Lynn actually does a really great job with this, and I think it would have been very easy for this to be very paint by numbers, and to an extent, there is an element of that where there isn't any flashy auteur type. This is my mark of what I am as a director. We don't get any of that, but I think what we do get is very much a unique portrait of the stage show, and you know, I think using the one man show at the start and having that essentially be acting as our like interlace reference is the
Yeah, where it
unique way.
sets the framework
Yeah,
for it.
yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that's, you know, I think that's a very unique and different way to approach this story. I think I really liked the way that he does handles that. Um, like I don't think there's anything overly memorable about the way Lynn directed it, but I also think that this would have very easily, in the hands of a lesser director, I think this movie could have come across as preachy, and I don't think it ever does. I think it comes across from a genuine place of love and heart and sincere, and a sincerity that can only really come from someone who is so clearly influenced by this man.
Absolutely. You can feel the love and the reverence that Lynn has for Jonathan through
Yeah.
the entire movie. You can tell that it was handled very much with a lot of care. And I do think that that love and that care and that admiration, you know, because Lynn talks about how he went to see Tick Tick Boom like as a stage production.
Yeah.
And I think making part of the framework of the story, you know, be that we open the movie with the stage show, but then we also throughout the movie, it's basically the stage show is telling us the story. We keep
Yeah.
going back to revisiting that performance, and it leads us through where we need to go,
Mm.
which I think was a great way to incorporate a lot of the music
Yep.
in a really organic way, but also, you know, to pay homage to the fact that that's what the stage show was.
Yeah.
Like that's kind of the essence of where all of this started and where it came from.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that that's how the way that it I think the way that it gets, essentially, you're right. That's how it tells it. Hey, this is a musical, but it happened in real life, because we only really get the one fantasy sequence,
Yeah,
and whereas in everything else, does really, it's being told from Larson's point of view, and you know, I think that the it perfectly is summed up at the start where it says everything here happened except for the parts Jonathan made up. Like,
right,
I think that sums up what this story is, yeah, it's autobiographical, but it's also telling a story. Like, he knows, I'm telling a story here. There's things in this that didn't happen. There's things in this that life doesn't happen in a 3-act structure.
right.
You
Yeah.
and I think that that's kind of the point, and I think that that's where it decides, "Hey, we're gonna have some fun with this," and the music, I think, really helps with that.
So this is more of just like a fun question.
Mm.
Being a person who is very much not, you know, Broadway musical theater inclined, how many cameos outside of the Hamilton cast did you actually recognize in the movie?
Um, Took even me a bit to recognize that there were Hamilton cast members in there, I'm not gonna lie. Um, I knew a few of them, but definitely nowhere near.
There's one that you had to have recognized that's like the
Yeah,
main one.
no, I'm pretty sure there was a few that I did recognize, and, like, genuinely recognized, but yeah, a lot of them I was like, "Oh god, who are these people?" Um, so yeah, no, that's, yeah, I definitely I like I said, I'm not the massive Broadway theater, and that's why, like,
You
the first
okay,
time
you at least you have to have at least recognized Bernadette Peters, right? When she showed up.
oh, yes, no, I definitely, yeah, Bernadette yeah, I did recognize her.
Okay.
Um, but, like, I when that sequence happened the first time I saw it, I, like, I knew enough about it to be like, "Okay, I kinda get what's going on here," but I also was like, "Okay, this seems a little weird," and then afterwards, having watched it again since you're going, oh, this is just the cameo sequence that is the
Yeah.
homage to Sondheim, and again, knowing that, it plays a lot better for me, like a lot better, and it definitely works. And I'm like, okay, no, I get this now.
So like
But
having the context of
yeah,
like
like
going back and
knowing context around that scene, Sunday works 1,000 times better than it did originally when in theaters, where it was like, this is a little out of place. This is weird, and but like not knowing the context was the reason why it was a little out of place and a little bit weird.
fair. Fair enough. Well, I think that pretty much covers everything that I wanted to ask you about. Is there anything that we haven't touched on about either of these movies that you feel like you wanted to say? Or because
I mean,
were these two your like top two movies from 2021? Were they your favorites?
they were. I mean, if I go back and look at the list now, they probably are. I
Okay.
think when we did them in 22, look, I was massive on West Side Story. And with hindsight, it probably was too massive. Like I was like I really loved West Side Story, but the more distance that's gone from 2022 to also from 2021 to now, Inside has stayed, and West Side Story has kind of like is still a top 10 movie. Don't get me wrong, but it's not as number two film of all time. Tick Tick Boom was number one, absolutely. Like Tick Tick Boom was number one, and it still is. Like I think Tick Tick Boom was the best film last year. I think it absolutely is one of my favorite movies, if not like it's up there as one of my all-time favorite movies. Like I love this movie. Um, but the Inside Inside was always hard because of its qualifications. Like because of the uniqueness of it all, I've always found it difficult. Where do I put it? Where is the where is it put in the list? And that's always been difficult for me. But right now, it's definitely the one I've thought about the most since outside of Tick Tick Boom since 2021.
Fair enough. I mean, I at the end of the day, I know that people get very touchy about how to classify things and how to rate things and trying to fit things into boxes.
Mm.
But from the sounds of it, these are two pieces of art that have stuck with you more than anything
Yeah,
from 2021.
no, they
So,
have. Yeah, they definitely have. And I'm someone who is a bit of a stickler for my top 10 list. I have a very particular way about how I have to do it and how it has to be. Um, and I'm also someone who generally, once I do it, that's it. It's done. It stays, and I don't touch it. It's not an organic changing thing that, like, I like obviously down the line I go through and I'll change them every now and then, but like typically I like keeping it. No, this is what it was at this point when I made this list. I don't like changing them very often. So maybe if I did it today, that would probably change, and the list would probably be a very different list.
well, Mr. Film critic over there, I I think that this is probably the most that I've heard you just go on unprompted about a movie in two different instances.
Mm,
Like, I think this is the most that I've ever just heard you just let it all out. And
yeah,
it's from just such a personal place. I don't think when it comes to either of these films, you really talked about anything technical, like in terms of
no,
production or anything. Like these feel like very personal movies for you, which I
th-
love. I think that's great. I
they
just think
are.
it's fascinating.
These two movies are probably two of the most personal movies that I have, that are from a real personal point of view, that are like there's a few others obviously, but these two are up there as two really genuinely personal films that hit me in a real personal way, and I'm devastated that I will never be able to own them physically. Because Netflix is, yeah, they're both Netflix movies too, which of course they are, and that's,
I think eventually we'll be able to own Tick Tick Boom physically.
yeah,
Um,
Criterion,
like
get on it.
I do think that'll happen. Inside,
I'm really
hmm,
hoping. I'm really hoping one day
I'm
I can get
I'm
inside.
I'm feeling like at some point you'll be able to buy it like through Bo, like through
Yeah,
his site, possibly. I don't know. We'll have to look into that because I would love to own both of these. They are
yeah,
also definitely at the top. Like Tick Tick Boom was my number one in
yeah,
2021 as well. And Inside was always like near the top of that
yeah.
list. So I would also very much, if anyone's listening that can do anything about it, we would very much like to give you money to own physical copies of both of these things. That would be wonderful. Thank you very
Official
much.
versions, not boot.
Official,
Yeah,
officially produced,
yeah.
like actual versions of these pieces of art. That would be wonderful. Well, if there's nothing else that you want to add about either of these lovely, wonderful, amazing creations that have been gifted to us in our lives, why don't you let the people know what you've got going on, where they can find you online?
Assuming that it's still around when this airs, you can find me on Twitter and Letterboxd and everywhere at Jacob London. I'm pretty much everywhere at Jacob London. And you can find me on my podcast once a week on the at Lights on a Screen podcast, along with Taylor Robinson.
Yes, we do the Lights on a Screen podcast pretty much on a weekly basis. We try to keep up with that, and that is new releases as
Hmm.
they're coming out, which is a lot of fun. So, you guys should all check that out if you haven't already. Everyone can find me at Finally Tailored pretty much everywhere online. Hopefully, hopefully, Twitter's still around at this point. I don't know. It could be good, could be bad. We don't know,
It could be gone.
but it could be gone. Letterboxd is where I post a lot of my movie stuff if you want to keep up with that. Otherwise, just social media in general, you can probably find me. Thank you guys once again for listening in to episode 3. I hope you will stick around to find out who I will be having on for the next episode and what we will be talking about. Until then, we will see you next time.